I'll always remember that drive. I drove through the countryside, right at the heart of summer it seemed, and yet you could see, lurking behind the green already, that faint hint of yellow that would come of autumn and death. I remember it had been a wet summer. Storms echoed across the mountains, and I'm not fanciful, but it was a long drive, and I seemed to see figures in the lightning. I hadn't seen Roderick, 20 years. Roderick Usher. Occasionally you saw his name. He was an artist. The kind of artist that, if his family wasn't one of the oldest in the country, would have had to find some other profession. Oh, I'm not saying his paintings were bad. They were beautiful in their way. But they were all infused with a strange, eerie light that made you think you saw something different than the straightforward manor house or tree he painted. And I heard that he had taken to composing long, sad songs of late. But he had written to me, you see, a letter saying that he was ill and that he needed to see me before the end. He had been the friend of my youth. I was so moved that he thought of me at the last. So here I was, driving through a countryside I didn't know very well, to a man I hadn't seen in 20 years. At last, when I'd asked around a bit, for it was not obvious where he lived, I came to a very high yew hedge, and at last a long gravel path that led up and up and up through a twisty, twiny set of turns, climbing always to the top of a knoll. It wasn't high, but it was steep. And at the top it was like a crater, and there was a dark, dark tarn, or pool, or pond. And beyond it, I shivered to see it. There was one of those kind of crazy houses that some artist 100 years ago or more might have made. It could have been made of marble, or stone, or bone. For I was coming as the light was failing, and caught by moonlight, it seemed as if it glowed white. That kind of blue light the moonshine makes. I parked carefully, for the drive was full of potholes, and looking back down it, I couldn't see the path on which I'd come. As I went towards the house, I noticed, I almost stumbled a narrow creek that seemed to lead in a strange, sinuous way, like a stream or a bone, to the house. I stepped gingerly over it, and came at last up 7 great stairs, and knocking on the door, it opened. And although there was a light, and I could see that there was a shabby old hall, all I first saw was darkness and shadows. And at the end of the corridor, there was a woman. I might have taken it for Roderick, but he was wearing a dress. And she stared at me with eyes that did not see me. I said, "Is Roderick in?" And then she was lost in the shift and the shadow. I stepped through the door carefully, and suddenly, coming out of, I guess, the library, was the tall man I knew, thinner and gaunter, with hair, what was left, all silver. And he said, "Thank God you have come. I have missed you this week or more." I came as quick as I could. "What do you wish me to do?" I've come because I want you to review my recent collection. It will be my last collection. Oh, do not talk like that. I know your reviews have not been good, but you have come to the right man. I will give you as good a review as your work merits. Then let us eat, and then I will show you my paintings, my masterworks. And he went to the back of the house and forbade me to follow him. I sat in the library where there was a cold little fire. I huddled over it. After 15-20 minutes there was a sound like a gong, and I went through, and there was Roderick with as fine as dinner as I thought he could muster. A roast chicken, some potatoes that would have been roasted a few days ago. They were leathery. And greens, and I thanked him as he poured me out old Takai. Quite excellent. And I said, "What about the woman?" And Roderick looked at me and said, "She will not be eating here. That is my sister." Is there anything wrong with her? She didn't say hello. She has catalepsy. It was as like as enough as she was walking in her sleep. And Roderick did as a man would do, who hadn't seen another in 20 years. He talked of our old university days, and asked me whether I kept up with our friends. Well, I did. And I knew what's more, he didn't. For he had just dropped out of the scene when we'd finished. And to all the others it was as if he had never been. But I am dogged, and I know a fine artist. I said, "Shall we ring for the servants to clear up the meal at the end?" He smiled and said, "I'll do it later. I will do it later." And I knew what that meant. I did not challenge him. I did not want to humiliate him. For I knew that although he lived off family wealth, that wealth was not infinite. He couldn't afford servants. So I said to him, "Shall we see the art?" And he led me then out into what I suppose might have been a lounge in another time. There it was, though. And he sat me down on the only comfortable seat and said, "Stay there. I will get what I can." And he left the room. And again I sat, and there was another small, inadequate fire there. And a lantern I could smell. He still used oil, whale oil, fishy, unpleasant. And I think the lantern must have been shedding smoke, for something like a haze or a darkness hung up on the ceiling. And as I looked around, suddenly I felt eyes behind me. I turned, and there she was again, silent, the woman. And as I was about to say something, I realised she had already gone, and that strange dark haze had covered her. Just then, Roderick came from the other side of the room, bringing with me a most excellent portfolio. He had done endless studies of this house, and they were beautiful. Eerie, obviously. Crazy. Often in a strange purple light that your eye couldn't quite fix. There was one study, he called it the Palace in Ruins, and it was clearly modelled on his house. But the wall had fallen in, and that strange creak had grown, so it seemed to be like a leech sucking out the bones of his house. I shivered to see it. And then he turned, and I saw he had got out a guitar. And I thought to myself, oh well. And he started to sing me. Now Roderick had a fine baritone, and he sang in a crazy, wild, wailing way, endless songs, all, he said, of my own composition. Well, I knew that. Mad songs of loss and loneliness, of living in a house that is partly a creature, of a devouring hunger and a haunting demon. I shivered. And I said, I do not know how long you're expecting me. I cannot go home tonight. And Roderick smiled and said, you cannot go home for a week or more. We have much to do and to talk about. More than that, have you not heard? A hurricane is blowing in. We will be safe upon our hill, but who knows what will happen down below. And as he said it, there was a sound like lightning, and I looked out the window, and I saw he was right. The wind was blowing up. And he took me then to a quiet bedroom at the back of the house. And there I would have spent a peaceful night. But every time I woke up, I almost felt eyes on me. So much so that although my watch told me it was 4 o'clock, I got up and I looked out, and the moon was gone. There were clouds. Suddenly a flash of lightning showed me the house wall, and I realised I wasn't at the back at all. I was at the front. And by the trick of the lightning light, I saw the strange creek seem to grow and shift as if it was attaching to the house. And its waters, purple, treacherous, were rising. Well, the next day, Roderick paced around the house while all outside the storm lashed. I tried to interest him in politics. He wasn't interested. In books I'd read, he hardly cared. I did remember all he ever really liked was chivalric romances. And by lunchtime we were sitting listening to the wind, when all of a sudden there was a scream in the wind. I shivered and was as a man frozen, and Roderick ran upstairs to where he shouted, saying his sister was there. I paced up and down, listening to the wind, wishing there had been a servant, wishing there was anyone. I opened the door and looked out. The rain was coming down like I was under a river. And indeed, the little creek was wider than it had been. I did not like the look of it. It was as if the dark waters were moving towards the house. I watched the trees in tumult, the black clouds growing ever blacker as lightning's mad sword struck and struck again across the sky. Watching it, I almost forgot Roderick for a moment. But suddenly he tapped me from behind and said, "It is my sister. She is dead." With such a portentous voice, I turned and said, "I'm so sorry." And he closed the door and he said, "But I do not wish to tell anyone yet. For if I tell them, they will certainly chop her up to check whether she's dead or alive. She's a cataleptic. But I know she is dead. We must take her to the family tomb. I have a stone sarcophagi. We'll lay her in, and after 2 weeks, she'll be so clearly dead they'll just let us bury her in the churchyard." As the rain poured down and the lightning forked, as all electricity in the house, there was some but not much, failed, I found myself up in the sister's room, a strange dark room, filled with old crosses it seemed, covered in dirt and grime. At another time it might have delighted me, but as even the dirt seemed to be moving from the walls, as if the house was growing tendrils that must have, I'm sure, been cobwebs. But at that moment I could have sworn were tentacles. I shivered, and I took the feet of the sister, who, seeing her like Roderick, I could barely tell them apart. And Roderick said, "Yes, she is my twin, and so like unto me, it was uncanny. We will take her to the tomb." and I carried the body, which was cold, but whose cheeks I saw were red, even though her lips were totally pallid and her teeth long. We carried her this way and that, Roderick sometimes stumbling, not quite sure where he was going, until at last, I guess it must have been deep below my room, we came to a great vault of stone, and with a strange, curious key he opened it, forcing a wooden door of old oak inwards. And there was indeed a stone sarcophagi, and he laid his sister in it. And all the while I looked at her pink cheeks, and her pale lips, and her sharp teeth. And I looked at him, and I saw how he shivered to touch her. And he said at last, "This is what it must be." And as we left, he closed the door, locking it, and put an extra padlock on it. And we went up the stairs, and he turned to me and said, "It is done." But as he said it, thunder crashed. Well, we spent that day pacing up and down. I read him the funeral service to try and calm his mind. It seemed to work for a while. And the next day he said we would have a requiem in the family chapel for her soul, him and me. And although the lightning streaked still, I remember the next day we did. It was crazy. We sang old Latin songs, and Roderick, who could play the organ, played it long and hard all day. Only once did I look out in the dark, and the creek seemed to be growing and coming ever towards the house. But I didn't like to point it out to Roderick. The house was old, I thought. It must just be the waters returning. It won't be the first time this has happened. The next morning I woke up. Roderick was at the end of my bed. He was white as a sheet, and he said, "It will happen today. Today, I tell you, it will happen today." When I took him down, I gave him coffee and food, and he took a bit of laudanum, I noticed. He looked ill, and I said, "Can we get through, do you think yet?" And he looked out, and the storm was still raging, and he said, "No, not today, maybe tomorrow. But we won't get a chance tomorrow." And the rain pierced down, and although I stood under the portico, I realised as I looked there was no chance we could get out tomorrow. Or so it seemed to me, for the very drive must be choked up with yew trees fallen. So many were falling in the wind. After lunch, I turned to Roderick and I said, "I will tell you stories. Let me tell you of the old Arthurian romances. Do you remember when we were young? And I read you all of Mallory." And Roderick smiled and said, "I remember." And as he said it, he jumped and seemed to hear something, but I only heard the wind. So I took him to my room, which I had decorated as gents do to be the sanest, and we had long cigarettes and short drinks, and I started to tell him that noble story of the knight Ceolwald, who rode through a yew forest deep and hard, and as the rain pierced down, drummed down, came at last by a little mere to an old chapel. And he looked at the gaping door of the chapel, and he looked inside, and there was something about him that made him scared. He did not go in, although the rain came piercing down. And next to the chapel, he saw there was a shield, and the shield said, "For those who can see the dragon and slay it, the shield is theirs." And on the other side there was a second note, and that read, "But for those who go within and are lost, all hope is gone." And the knight wondered what it meant, and he turned back, and the chapel looked even more inviting. There seemed to be a fire inside, and he seemed to see saints were singing. But he took a step further back, and he realised what he took to be a fire was the fire of a dragon, and what he took to be saints were dancing teeth. And then he took out his holy sword, mistletoe, and struck down at the very living wall of the chapel. And such was the holy power of that blessed blade that had once belonged to King Offa, that it struck the dragon's face in two. Just at that moment, the shield fell down from its fastening on the ground with a loud metal clang. And just at that moment, there was a sound like a door forced, followed by a metal clang, as if a lock was torn down. And Roderick screamed and said, "She's free! It has happened! I've been hearing that noise all day." And he looked up, and coming through the dark, I saw for a moment his sister, with her pale, pale lips and pink cheeks, looking, eyes open and deadly at him. And he fell down, clutching his heart, stricken with fear. I turned to him, and I turned back, and there was only darkness where his sister had been, and the house started to quiver. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared. I ran down and out. And as I ran out, I had to jump for the great chasm now, like a leech, had reached the house. And I jumped over it, falling again and again, turning, looking back as lightning hit the house, as the very mirror seemed to move, and the house tumbled in and was gone. In a moment, punctuated by lightning flashes, again and again and again, I saw it fall, devoured to the foundations and all. And those were the last bouts of lightning. The storm was gone. I went back. I slept in my carriage. The next day, dawn came. The roads were clear, and I drove home. I did not know who to report Roderick's life or death to. Of his possessions, I only kept that painting he had shown me, that he had given me, of the palace in the strange purple light, lit by lightning, and I kept it. For it was that moment, you see, that moment his sister came up, and the lightning streaked by the house as the leech reached it. It was that moment painted in prophecy of his death. I cannot sell it. I take it out sometimes, and it haunts my dreams all times. I who saw the fall of the house of Usher.